So much. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you so much to Kilan, and of course to all of you for joining. We'll go ahead and get this part out the way. It's 1:30 a.m. so I'm going to get excited and I'm going to be awake, but caffeine is going to be a common theme throughout this talk, and now I realize why it's such an important part of my life. So thank you everyone for coming in. So I'm going to go a bit through my story just as a person and my journey to how I've ended up in Perth, Western Australia. I was born in Tampa, Florida. So just a resident Floridian, born and raised, whole life, won Florida State softball championship there, always come back, and everybody say hi to my mom and dad who are still in Tampa, and I haven't been home in 2 years, so they miss me. You know, this is kind of the story that we'll tell, is that somehow this Boriqueña ended up from Tampa, Florida, and is now living in Perth, Western Australia. I can tell you when I got on the flight to move to Perth, I hadn't quite located where it was on the map yet. But now looking back, that's a long time ago, and I've been living in Australia for 17 years. So it's been a long journey, and I'm really grateful. And I did move to Australia about 4 years after they hosted their Olympic Games in 2000. And I think it was a really changing time in Australia for the area I'm working in now, which is sports science. In fact, Australia was known for being the first kind of country to really drive sports science in the modern times. And so that's how I ended up there. But where I started was, of course, that little girl that always played on the boys' teams and just stuck out in everything I did. So anything that someone told me I couldn't do, that was absolutely the thing I wanted to do. And that theme probably still is true to this day. So, you know, when I was growing up, I knew that I just liked science and dinosaurs like everybody else, math and sport. And at the time, I didn't think those two things could go together. So I just played sport over here and then went to school and really enjoyed science, kind of just as a curiosity. But at that time, I didn't even think it was really like a career option for me. And, you know, funny enough, with Alexis saying, going the military route, I actually had enlisted in the military as well when I was 17, thinking that that was going to be the way I could afford to go to university. At the same time, I was playing basketball and softball in college. And when you talk about the opportunities that can really change your life, one of the benefits of playing was that I was offered a full scholarship to go to university. So that fundamentally changed my path. I was going to go into the military and military intelligence. I had my assignment, but another door opened and I had the opportunity to go directly into university. And so that's what I did. And that's why in my introduction, I had the chance to play 4 years of college basketball and college softball. And then at the same time, kind of start my journey in STEM more formally. You know, and in my head, I thought that maybe one day I could combine my love of sport and my love of science. But at the time, these two things didn't seem like they overlapped at all. And on the screen is just one of our projects that we're working on right now. And we basically look at how different athletes are able to adapt or be athletic. And we actually measure that using quite a lot of sensors, which I'll talk about. But it's the perfect blend for me where I get to nerd out looking at the science of it. But at the same time, I'm still having the fun that I've always enjoyed, just about the underpinning of having sport be the key factor. So it's not a bad life to every day you're paid to study sport. It's really a ridiculous thing that I have to remind myself actually is a career for me. So where I am right now, like I said, Perth, Western Australia, we're that only city that's on the west coast of Australia. Every other major city is pretty much on the east coast, where everybody kind of knows where Sydney is, maybe even Melbourne at the bottom. We're the one all by ourselves. We're known as the City of Lights. And the reason for that was when we were doing a space flight and they were coming over, the only city you could identify clear as day is Perth, Western Australia, because there is so much darkness around that while flying over, looking down at the great earth that we have, Perth, Western Australia lights up like no other, because to the west of us, we have the Indian Ocean, and there is nothing out there until you get to a small, tiny island of Mauritius. And then you finally get to Madagascar and then Africa. And then when you go to the east, you have a giant, basically desert for thousands and thousands of miles until you get to the East Coast. There's no major cities in between. It is nothing like America where you can weave your way through small towns. That doesn't happen here. So Perth, being the city of lights, is where I currently live. And as was said, I'm at Edith Cowan University. It's a young university here in Western Australia. We have 4 other universities in our city. And then my other position is a sports science coordinator, which I'll talk about quite a bit, for Softball Australia. Of course, we just finished competing in the Tokyo 2021 Olympics. And you know, that was a really big turning point, because when I first moved here, having played softball myself and was working with the athletes then, some of the athletes I first worked with when I moved to Australia finally got to compete in their first Olympic Games 16 years later. And so to be able to see that entire journey is something I'm also really grateful for. And it kind of came about because I was in science and sport at the same time. So, you know, when you start out, I kind of have a joke, but, you know, you have birth and then you have the years where you swear you're going to be a paleontologist. So most of us have some fixation on dinosaurs at some point in our life. I definitely had that. That was probably the start of science for me. And then it continued on. I probably dwindled off into definitely marine biology. And then I made my way just into biology. And to be honest, having the opportunity to go to university for sport, I went to a university that didn't have a major that I was probably really keen on. I probably would have went into something like engineering, but they didn't have it. So I just did human biology. And at the same time, they had this other degree that had the word sport in it. And so that seemed like a good idea at the time. And it was sport management. And I did both of those degrees and ended up graduating with my bachelor's of science in both of those at Barton College in Wilson, North Carolina, leaving Florida, which was sad in itself. But after that, I met quite a lot of individuals that I realized the importance of mentorship and listening to those people that are giving you their time. And I had an individual that reached out and said, you know, there's a profession I think you'd be interested in, and I'm not sure if you're thinking about it. And she actually directed me more towards strength and conditioning at the time, less the sports science, which wasn't as common in the early 2000s in the US at the time. And on that journey, I commenced going to University of Wisconsin at La Crosse, working my first job as a strength conditioning coach, and started my master's degree as well in exercise science, which kind of led me to my next little mentorship opportunity, where I had 2 professors that said, you know, your science side that you're enjoying, you know, you can actually do research in sport, and that's an area. This is the first time where I started to finally connect the science and sport. And so with that, I actually changed universities, and I stayed in a Master of Science, but I switched over to an exercise science degree, which at the time was a lot more prevalent. I went to Appalachian State back in North Carolina, graduated there. And then this is the big moment. My mentors there then said, you know, Australia is doing really great work in this area, and they have degrees in sports science. And I said, wait a second, this is the perfect marrying. This is sports science. And this is where I was provided the opportunity to do my PhD. And I ended up moving to a city that I hadn't quite located on a map. And it is approximately, I think, 15,000 miles away from where most of you are right now. And I ended up graduating eventually in 2009 with my doctorate in sports science. Now, that's my educational path, but I can tell you that most of that was just grabbing onto any opportunity that was put forward, and always kind of focusing on, you know, I enjoy this topic. I know this is teaching me certain skill sets. And so if I looked at this a different way, I think one of the most important things that someone actually told me, and having played softball, this made a lot of sense to me. Those of you that aren't in sport, it won't ring as true, but they always say you can't steal second with your foot on first. And I remember trying to make each one of these decisions to move what seemed like further and further. And now I'm at the furthest point away on the globe that I could possibly be from those that I basically grew up with. And all I kept telling myself was, the only constant in this life is change. And so even if you change and you don't like it, you can always change back. So each one of these opportunities, I just kept moving forward. And I definitely remember you got to move forward in order to get to the next thing. And so, I wasn't one of those people that knew where I was going. I just kind of enjoyed the process. But what I really was quite good at was just always gaining new skills. And every time you gain a new skill, then you can solve more and more problems. And if you're a person that can solve problems, you are invaluable. And you'll find yourself in all kinds of crazy positions with all kinds of different titles. And the titles don't really matter, but what you do and what you enjoy really does. So when I was living in Tampa, actually, when I started my sport management degree, I would come back to Tampa in the summers, and I had a job when the Tampa Bay, then Devil Rays, but Tampa Bay Rays, were their opening season in 1998. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm not quite sure about the sport management thing. I love the sports side, but the management thing is probably not. But all of the skills that I grew there, and organization, resourcing, logistics, just communication, working in a big stadium with a major league team. And I moved on from that. I've never went back to that, but probably each one of the roles that I've had, I was able to kind of leverage off some of those early skill sets. And when I went to Barton College, I did my biology. The basics in science take you everywhere. And so for us in STEM or STEAM more broadly, there's no learning's ever wasted in science, because you will find the ability to problem solve every single place you look. And as I continued through my career, I actually picked up some other skills in coaching, skill acquisition, so basically how to learn, team dynamics. And then as I moved up further and further, it's in critical thinking, which is like the founding building blocks for anything. And then it's only much later in my career, the specifics in what I do now: biomechanics, statistics, programming. So computer programming is pretty big. And then more now looking at leadership and governance. So, when I think about my path, I definitely didn't plan it, but I did really enjoy learning every single place I went. And so I kind of give the advice all the time, or not even advice, is when we're younger, curiosity, the number one thing you ask is why? Why do we do this? And at some point, we stop asking that question so much. And if I thought about one of the things that I didn't plan for, but I kept throughout my entire skill path, I'll call it, instead of educational path, is I always loved asking why. And I never stopped curiosity being the number one driver for me throughout all of those things. So, as much as I thought the travel all the way to Perth to do my job was crazy, since I've lived here and have been working in sports science, I've been really, I've had all the opportunities to almost travel to every major continent in the world and all of the major cities in the world. I probably can't even list them. But each one of those opportunities has just been because I've been curious and I've been willing to take the chance on opportunities. So with that path in mind, a lot of individuals maybe don't know what a sports scientist is, what they do, what their life looks like. And sometimes we use the term performance scientist. So I thought I'd throw it out there. So I'd like to take a couple minutes to kind of talk about a day in the life and a couple of the roles that I've had. I currently work with Softball Australia. I used to work with Surfing Australia, really different sports, but the underpinning is the same. And so this is that kind of lesson learned, is that the skill set, the basis, but you can jump around to all kinds of different environments and then overlay this idea around curiosity, problem solving, and the scientific basis to any other sport, in my case, but to really any other field. So when I'm working with Softball Australia, one of the key things we're often looking at is pitching. It's a key driver. And so you, of course, have your coaches in the background that are trying to get the athletes to acquire the skill. And what we work in the background for them is giving them the metrics and the numbers behind each one of their performance. So I'd like to say that particularly with this sport, you get to mix physics with statistics with what we call coaching science or skill acquisition. And so the physics of the spin of the ball and how that changes, the break, how difficult it is to hit, are the things that we give feedback to the coach. Then the coach has to translate that to get the athlete to be able to change the things we need them to change on the ball or on the way they move to actually get those physics principles to come about. Most of our day can be a mix of this. Team meeting in the morning, everyone talks about what our goals are for the day, go out to the field with the athletes. You have all your instruments, making sure everything's charged up, set up, calibrated, collecting data, come back, process, debrief, have another team meeting, repeat. And so the best parts of the day are, it's really active, it's really dynamic. You have some parts where you're outside working with the sports live. Then you have some parts where you come back and you're nerding out on the computer and you're doing all the science things. So you get that mixture through the day that helps you break it up. And that's probably the best of both worlds for me, because as much as I like being on my computer, I also like being out on the field and getting out and moving. So sometimes we're out on the field and we're working with the athletes there. But then another large part of what we do is in a very controlled environment. So this is at the Australian Institute of Sport. The benefit of this is that we get really high fidelity cameras around, and we can pretty much capture the athlete's movement to within 1/10 of a centimeter of accuracy at all their major joints. And then we do the same thing that we would do in the live feedback on the field, but we're doing it within the context of what's basically a science lab, but for sporting performance. So some of the things that we're measuring are what I said there, same thing, is that you have the metrics on the ball, and then you also have the metrics on the athlete as well. I'm just gonna take a quick pause. No worries. This will probably help. All good? I was just sharing the screen. Perfect. So as far as in the surfing environment, that same thing that we're just seeing there, where we are capturing the 3D motion of the athlete. We do the same thing, but we replicate it. And then we have the athletes replicate on land, and then they do the same thing in the surf. So surfing is kind of one of those funny sports where technology seems like a great idea until you have salt water around. And so what we've had to do is basically go through huge amounts of piloting and waterproofing on top of the fact that we go through the biomechanics and the monitoring of the athlete's joints. So in this scenario with the athletes, I've got some of my scholars. Saltwater is good until there's electronics. I've got some of my scholars with me, and what they do, they set the athletes up. They're putting their sensors. So we have what we call an inertial measurement units that measure the rotation, the accelerations of each one of their joints. And then we can calculate the joint angles that they're going through. So like I was saying before, you get this perfect mix of kind of the physics of it, as well as the movement of it. So it's that merge between the science and the sport. So, you know, that's a day in the life of a sports scientist, but I really did start as a strength conditioning coach. So a lot of individuals will ask me, okay, in the sports science realm, is it just the science, or do you have all your team members around you? And you usually have a whole bunch of team members. So in my manager role at Surfing Australia, I had my sports scientists. Some specialize in biomechanics, some specialize in physiology. Then we had other individuals that would specialize in strength and conditioning. We have our skill acquisition coach. You have your therapists or your sport docs, and all of us come together to try to improve that athlete. So in the day-to-day environment for the surfer, in addition to measuring how they perform, you're obviously trying to improve them physically so they can continue to perform to the best of their ability. So some of the things we'll do is look at the movement patterns that are really common in the sport. And then the strength and conditioning coaches are aligning the movement patterns that the sports scientists have identified are critical. And they try to replicate what we call the joint loadings that are happening on the athletes. And what we'll do here is we'll have little units sitting on the athlete. They'll be surfing. And by having the video at the same time as the units, we can see the accelerations that the athletes have acting on their body, how much velocity they have in their turns, and we can get the strength and conditioning coaches to try to replicate those loadings on the land or in the different movements they have, so that when they go back out to the surf, that they are prepared for that. So that's kind of the story for the sports scientists. But when we get into the fun part is trying to figure out ways to enhance how quickly an athlete can get a really difficult skill. So if you've watched surfing anytime recently, surfing's becoming all about the aerial game. So we try to go up, they're trying to do flips. It's very much like skateboarding. So some of the things that we're doing with the surfers, or we've done while I was at the Hurley Surfing Australia Center, is that we have the athletes practice all of the different movements they want to perform on the surf using skateboards. These are all surfers. They drop in, they don't have to actually do anything. It just takes the momentum, and they can practice the flips hundreds of times, which they would never be able to practice because of surf conditions, so that when they finally get a wave where they think they can land this maneuver, they've already practiced it hundreds of times through land training. So it's a bit of a mixture of doing the strength and conditioning, like I said, creativity and the art behind watching, seeing movements, patterns, and then the science of trying to measure that. So over my time, I've moved from strength conditioning coach to sports scientist, sport manager, where I'm managing lots of different individuals. But my role now is, I'm a professor of human performance. And before I got that title, I wasn't quite sure what that meant. But I thought that I'd show you more of what my day-to-day role is now. The benefit that I have now is I have the chance to drag more people from all over the world to kind of follow this path of connecting their love of sport with their love of science. So Adam Bent, who's one of my former PhD students, he's already finished. He came over from Texas, and he was an elite 100 meters track and field runner himself. Now completed his PhD, has also stayed in Western Australia though. And for his PhD, he was looking at all of the effect of how we instruct athletes to run, so the coaching cues we give them, on changes in the biomechanics of that sprinter and whether that actually elicits enhancement in their performance. So on a given day for this athlete that's running through, in addition to obviously measuring their sprint times, we're measuring all of his joint positions as well as the muscle activity that they have in each one of their muscles. So their quadriceps, hamstrings, gastroc. So we can get a full prediction of how they're actually coordinating in order to do their sprint. Some days we're doing something really active and dynamic like that. Other days we're in what would be more a traditional lab, measuring more of what we'd call the intrinsic explanations of what happens to the body. So in this example over here, on the right-hand side, you can see that screen. That's actually an ultrasound image that's live of how someone's muscles actually contracting when they're producing force. From this, we get to predict, if they need to change something around their tendon mechanics, their muscle mechanics. And so it's the basic science of what's actually happening internal to an athlete instead of their big picture movement. So, a lot of what we do day to day in science is probably look at graphs. So my day to day is to mix kind of the graphs or the data visualization with the visualization that's familiar to us as athletes ourselves looking at 2D video, but this is 2D video with an overlay of their 3D kinematics. So for a coach, it's really meaningful because we can see the 2D movement, but for a scientist, it's really meaningful because we get the very accurate assessments, in this case over here, of looking at the knee loading that they have in different types of movements. For us, we're looking at that because there's such a high incidence of knee injuries, particularly in our female athletes, that we're trying to understand how we can better prepare them for the field. So in my day-to-day, I do some things that are research, and we publish those research papers and we disseminate it, and it's formal research practice. But I think the most meaningful things to me are that some of the things that we publish make a direct impact on real people's lives. So when I started my PhD, we were looking at the long-term effect of different training programs on enhancing softball athletes' performance. Some of the exact research participants that were in that study 16 years prior in the last Olympic Games got to compete and stand on the field representing their country. So that's 16 years of commitment that goes from the research around understanding how to maximize their performance, and you finally see it manifest in, the pinnacle of their games. And so for me, this was probably the most meaningful part of my entire journey, realizing that all of the effort, skill building, education finally amounted into making a real impact on people that I've had a 16-year relationship with as a coach and a scientist. And hopefully for some of you that are kind of interested, you'll start to see that, the science of sports mixes the two things, which is the scientific pursuit, the physics, the biomechanics, with the fact that sport is an avenue for change for people. So I'm talking about the avenue for change in performance in this instance, but I started this story by telling you that I had a fork in the road, that I had the opportunity to go to university in different ways. And because sport gave me the opportunity to go to university, it fundamentally changed kind of everything about my life's path. So sport is a vehicle for change. I think the thing I love about sports science is it gives me the science, and then it connects me with people through sport. And that's probably the thing that really drives me, along with this next thing, which is when I went through this path, there weren't a lot of people that looked like me. I don't meet a lot of Puerto Rican women in my profession, and I definitely don't meet a lot of openly gay women in my profession. And because of that, the way that people have gone about the research in the past has been absent of particular perspectives. And so I do a lot of work trying to enhance the opportunities and the provision of services for women in sport particularly. And in that, I've also done a lot of work and trying to change the narrative in our research, because there is a lot of bias, because there's not enough representation. And without our representation of people of color, people in the LGBTIQ+ community, without people from just a range of different backgrounds and gender diverse backgrounds, we get these biases that creep in. And the thing about science is we treat it as fact. But if it hasn't been created by a balanced number of us, then it's not the fact of all of us. And so I started just needing some opportunities to continue through. And I was lucky enough, sport gave me that opportunity. And now I'm trying to go full circle where I'm giving back these opportunities to people in sport through science. And I'm ensuring that we bring up more representation so we can improve our science. So the three parts of my role, if anyone was curious, I do a lot of this teaching and presenting. And benefit is that sometimes I get to go to different countries. And in this case, I got to present in Brazil, which was fantastic. And I also get to research and engage with the community. And that includes a lot of engagement, like I said, with our women in sport and our professional sports here in Australia. And I get to do a lot of service and activism. So I've mainly talked about my science side, my sports side, but I can't get through this talk without acknowledging that there's two groups that I contribute to a great deal. One is what we call Athena Swan, and that's for enhancing gender equity and intersectionality in science, technology, engineering, and maths, which our university is a member of. And I'm also a member of our Pride group, which is our diversity at ECU, which we have a theme of leading with love. And so that's enhancing our representation all across the university sector, but particularly in science, technology, engineering, and maths. So that's a bit of my story. It was a long one, and I wish I would have shared my screen a little earlier, but you got the videos in the end. And, you know, if I gave myself some words to my former self, the first thing that I would remind myself, which I managed to do, but there's so many individuals that try to take curiosity out of you, is to stay curious. It's the most commonly lost and desperately needed trait that we need in people throughout your entire life. The next thing is, don't try to be someone, just try to be someone that solves problems. So you should be a design for problems. And that's why we need a breadth of creativity and skills, so that we have people coming from different avenues to solve all the problems that we're going to have now and all the way into the future. And so with that, instead of trying to be a certain profession, I say just build the skills that you enjoy and just keep adding to your toolbox. Read far and wide, nonfiction and fiction both, and use that as your curiosity. The next thing is own your story. We definitely aren't boxes, although a lot of people try to put many of us into. We are definitely people, and take your whole self into everything that you do. The next thing is give it a go. That's an Australian saying, to give it a go. And the best thing about change is you can change again. And then the last thing is, hopefully you're going to end with this, is to reach out and ask questions. So C number one, stay curious, and ask all the STEAM people as many questions as possible. So that's it. And thanks so much for listening.